The Christmas lights draped over the banister porch in suburban Connecticut were meant to signal warmth and family unity. But inside, the silence at the dinner table was deafening. Daniel watched his wife, Elena, stare at her phone screen with a softness she hadn't shown him in months, her thumb hovering over a reply to a man who shouldn't even have her number anymore. It started with a charitable suggestion to host her ex-husband for the holidays, but the way she checked her reflection in the window glass suggested this wasn't about charity. It was about an open door she had promised to keep shut. If you find yourself drawn to the fragile, dangerous lines we draw between marriage and the ghosts of our pasts, stay with me, because the most painful secrets are often hidden in plain sight. The silence in the kitchen was usually comfortable, the kind born of 10 years of shared routines. But tonight it felt thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Outside the bay windows, the Connecticut winter was settling in, burying the manicured lawn under a fresh sheet of white. Inside, the only sound was the scrape of silverware against china and the hum of the wine fridge. Daniel sliced through his roasted chicken, sensing the vibration of his wife's anxiety from across the table. Elena hadn't touched her wine, a bold Cabernet he'd opened specifically for Friday night, and she kept glancing at her phone, which lay face down on the marble countertop. "You're going to wear a hole in the screen if you keep staring at the back of it," Daniel said, keeping his tone light. He didn't want to start a fight. He just wanted the weekend to begin. Elena looked up, her eyes wide, unguarded in a way that made Daniel's stomach tighten. She looked beautiful, her dark hair pulled back loosely, but there was a frantic energy beneath her skin. "I need to ask you something," she said. Her voice was too quiet. "And I need you to listen before you say no." Daniel put his fork down. The appetite he'd had 5 minutes ago evaporated. "Okay. It's about Julian." The name landed on the table like a dead bird. Julian, the ex-husband. The photographer who lived in Paris or Berlin or wherever people who refused to grow up lived these days. Daniel hadn't heard his name in 3 years. "What about him?" Daniel asked, reaching for his wine glass. He needed the fortification. "He's in New York," Elena said, the words tumbling out faster now. "He came back for a gallery opening, but it fell through. His agency dropped him. He called me this afternoon. He's staying in some awful motel in Queens, Daniel. He sounded bad, really bad." Daniel swirled the red liquid in his glass. "I'm sorry to hear that, truly, but I don't see what that has to do with us. He has nowhere to go for Christmas." Daniel froze. He looked at his wife, searching for a trace of irony, but found only desperate empathy. "Elena, no. Just for a few days," she pleaded, leaning over the table. Her hand crept toward his, her fingers cold. "He's spiraling. You know his history with depression. If he spends the holidays alone in a city where he feels like a failure, I'm scared of what he might do. We have the guest suite. We have so much space. It feels cruel to leave him out in the cold when we have so much." "He is your ex-husband," Daniel said, his voice measured, fighting the urge to raise it. "We are married. This is our holiday. My parents are coming on the 27th. You want to explain to my mother why your ex is sleeping down the hall? Your mother loves me. She'll understand charity," Elena countered, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Daniel, please. Show me you're the bigger man. Show me that we're strong enough to help someone who used to be family without it being a threat. Unless..." She paused, tilting her head. "Unless you don't trust me." It was a trap, a beautifully constructed emotional trap. If he said no, he was the jealous, insecure husband who didn't trust his wife. If he said yes, he was inviting a grenade into his living room. Daniel looked around their kitchen. The copper pots hanging orderly from the rack, the wreath on the pantry door, the life they had built brick by brick. He loved her. He loved her fierce heart, even when it was misguided, and arrogance perhaps played a part. He wanted to believe he had nothing to fear from a washed-up photographer with a history of instability. "Strictly the guest suite," Daniel said, his voice low. "And he leaves on the 26th. Elena exhaled, a sound of pure relief that sounded suspiciously like joy. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you. You're a good man, Daniel. The best man." She pulled her hand away to grab her phone. As Daniel watched her type a message with rapid, fluid thumbs, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room, even though all the windows were tightly shut. He took a long drink of wine, but it tasted like vinegar. The train from Grand Central was due at 6:45 p.m. By 6 p.m., the atmosphere in the Bannister household had shifted from festive to frantic. Daniel stood by the fireplace, nursing a bourbon he didn't really want, watching his wife dismantle their living room. She wasn't cleaning, she was curating. Magazines were straightened, the throw pillows were fluffed to impossible angles, and the lighting was dimmed to a level that suggested romance rather than hospitality. "You're pacing," Elena said, not looking up as she adjusted a vase of winter berries for the third time. "I'm standing still," Daniel corrected gently. "You're the one vibrating." He watched her move. She had gone upstairs an hour ago to freshen up, and returned wearing a deep emerald silk dress that clung to her frame. It was a garment reserved for galas or anniversary dinners at Le Bernardin, not a casual Saturday night hosting a charity case. Her scent, a heavy, spicy jasmine perfume she hadn't worn since their honeymoon, filled the room. "It's Christmas, Daniel. I want it to be nice," she said, catching his eye in the mirror. Her defensiveness was a sharp little blade. "He's been living out of a suitcase. I want him to feel human again." "You look beautiful," Daniel said, sidestepping the bait. "I just hope he appreciates the effort." The doorbell rang at 7:10 p.m. The sound seemed to echo too loudly in the high-ceilinged foyer. Elena froze for a split second, her hand flying to her throat, before she composed herself and walked to the door. Daniel followed a few steps behind, the dutiful guard dog. When the door opened, the winter wind rushed in, carrying the smell of snow and stale tobacco. Julian stood on the porch. He looked exactly as Daniel remembered, yet entirely different. He was thinner, his coat was a frayed wool trench that had seen better decades, and his hair was windblown in a way that looked effortlessly editorial. He carried a battered leather duffel bag and a bottle of wine held by the neck. "Elena," Julian said. His voice was raspy, warm, and stripped of any pretense. He didn't smile. He just looked at her as if she were a piece of art he had once owned and lost. "Julian," she breathed. She didn't hug him immediately. There was a hesitation, a charged pause that lasted 3 seconds too long before she stepped forward and embraced him. It wasn't a polite A-frame hug. She pressed her cheek against his cold coat, her eyes closing. Daniel cleared his throat. They broke apart. Julian looked over Elena's shoulder, his dark eyes locking onto Daniel. "Daniel, the architect of stability, thank you for letting us stray in." "Structural engineer," Daniel corrected automatically, extending a hand. "Good to see you, Julian." "Right. Structures, keeping things from falling down." Julian's grip was surprisingly strong, his hand cold. "God knows I could use some of that." Dinner was a performance. Daniel carved the roast, playing the role of the provider, while Julian provided the entertainment. He sat at the center of the table, ignoring the food, spinning stories about a loft in Berlin that had no heat, but perfect morning light, and a chaotic gallery opening in Prague, where the artist set the canvas on fire. Daniel watched his wife. Elena was leaning forward, her chin resting on her hand. Her dinner forgotten. Her eyes were bright, tracking Julian's gestures. She laughed at his jokes, a throaty, uninhibited laugh that Daniel hadn't earned from her in months. "Do you remember that night in Paris?" Julian asked, gesturing with his wine glass, a drop of red splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth. "When we missed the last train and slept on a bench near the Seine?" "And woke up covered in pigeon feathers," Elena finished for him, beaming. "God, we were so young, so stupid." "We were alive," Julian corrected softly. He looked at her, ignoring Daniel entirely. "We were wide awake." Daniel took a bite of the roast. It was dry. He swallowed it down with a large gulp of wine, feeling the heat rise in his collar. He sat at the head of the table in the house he paid for, wearing the watch she had given him. Yet he had never felt more like a stranger. The man in the frayed coat wasn't just a guest. He was a time traveler, and he had just transported Elena back to a world where Daniel didn't exist. Christmas Eve arrived with a biting wind that rattled the window panes, but inside the Bannister house, the temperature was rising for an entirely different reason. The tradition had always been simple. Daniel and Elena would open one bottle of vintage port, put on the same Bing Crosby record, and hang the ornaments they had collected over 10 years of marriage. It was a ritual of continuity. This year, however, the record player was silent. Julian had insisted on a more cerebral jazz playlist, streaming from his phone, a chaotic, discordant saxophone melody that made Daniel's teeth ache. They sat in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth. The tree was half decorated, the boxes of ornaments open on the Persian rug. Julian held a glass of Daniel's port, swirling it with the irreverence of someone who hadn't paid for it. "This house," Julian said, gesturing vaguely at the high ceilings and the tastefully beige walls. "It's very curated, Elena. It reminds me of that museum in Vienna. Beautiful, but you can't touch anything." Elena was sitting on the floor, unwrapping a silver star. She didn't look offended. She looked thoughtful. "We wanted something calm. New York is so loud." "You used to love the noise," Julian countered softly. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Remember the studio in Brooklyn? The one above the bakery? You painted that entire mural on the bedroom wall at 3 a.m. because you said the silence was killing you." Daniel stiffened. He knew about the studio. He knew about the mural, but hearing it resurrected now in his living room felt like an invasion. "Elena runs a gallery now," Daniel interjected, his voice firm. "She curates art. She doesn't need to paint on bedroom walls." Julian turned his gaze to Daniel, a small, pitying smile playing on his lips. "There is a difference between curating life and living it, isn't there, Daniel?" The air in the room grew heavy. Elena stopped unwrapping the ornament. She looked at the silver star in her hands, her thumb tracing the sharp point. "Julian tells this story," Elena said suddenly, her voice distant, as if she were talking to herself. "About the night we broke into the abandoned fairgrounds in Coney Island. The Ferris wheel," Julian filled in, his eyes locking onto hers. "We climbed to the top car. The wind was freezing, just like tonight. You screamed at the ocean. You said you never wanted to be ordinary. You made me promise never to let you become a suburban cliché." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel looked at his wife, waiting for her to laugh, to dismiss the youthful melodrama, to squeeze his hand and say, "I love our life." Instead, Elena looked up at Julian, her eyes glossy in the firelight. "I remember," she whispered. "I felt like I could fly." "You still can," Julian said, his voice dropping to a seductive murmur. "You just forgot you have wings." Daniel stood up abruptly. The movement was jarring enough to break the trance. "I'm going to check the locks," he said, though they had an automated security system that checked itself. "It's getting late." Neither of them moved to stop him. As Daniel walked into the dark hallway, leaving the warmth of the fire behind, he heard the clink of glass against glass. He paused in the shadows, looking back. He saw Julian reach out and tuck a stray lock of hair behind Elena's ear, a gesture so familiar, so possessive, that it felt like a physical blow. Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch just for a second, before picking up another ornament. Daniel walked to the front door and stared out at the empty, snow-covered street. He realized then that the charity he had agreed to was a lie. Julian hadn't come here for a warm bed. He had come to collect something he believed was still his. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure if Elena belonged to the house or to the memory of the man sitting on her floor. Christmas morning broke with a deceptive brilliance, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding whiteness that filled the living room. Under normal circumstances, this was Daniel's favorite hour, the quiet satisfaction of watching Elena open the boxes he had spent weeks researching, ordering, and hiding. He prided himself on being a good gift giver, the kind who listened to offhand comments in July to surprise her in December. But this year, there was a third mug of coffee on the table. Julian sat in the wingback chair, wearing a cashmere sweater that Daniel recognized as his own. "I hope you don't mind," Julian had said earlier, shivering in the kitchen. "I didn't pack for Connecticut winters." Daniel had nodded. "Because saying no to a cold man on Christmas made you a villain, even if the man was wearing your clothes." "You first," Elena said, handing a small, heavy box wrapped in silver paper to Daniel. He opened it to find a vintage watch, a sleek 1960s Omega. It was tasteful, expensive, and practical. "Thank you," he said genuinely. It was a wife's gift to a husband, solid, reliable, an investment. "Now yours," Daniel said. He reached behind the tree and pulled out the velvet box. He felt a sudden surge of insecurity as he handed it to her. Elena unwrapped it carefully. When she lifted the lid, the diamond necklace caught the morning light, scattering prisms across the ceiling. It was platinum, delicate, and cost more than his first car. "Oh, Daniel," she breathed. She touched the stones tentatively. It's stunning. Too much, really." She leaned over and kissed him. It was a soft, firm kiss, the kind of kiss one gives for a job well done. "Thank you. It's beautiful." She didn't put it on. She closed the box and set it on the side table next to her coffee. "I didn't have much time to shop," Julian said from the chair. His voice was low, raspy from sleep. He reached down and picked up a flat, rectangular package wrapped in simple brown butcher paper, tied with a piece of rough twine. "But I found this in my archives. I thought it belonged with you." Elena took the package. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the twine. The paper fell away to reveal a black and white photograph in a simple black frame. The room went silent. It was Elena, but a version of her Daniel had only seen in glimpses. She was standing on a fire escape in the rain, laughing with her head thrown back, her hair soaked, a cigarette dangling from her fingers. It was grainy, raw, and fiercely alive. It wasn't a picture of a wife or a curator. It was a picture of a muse. Elena stared at the image. Her breath hitched, a jagged sound that cut through the polite atmosphere. She didn't say, "It's beautiful." She didn't say, "Thank you." She simply stared, her eyes filling with tears that Daniel's diamonds hadn't summoned. "The night on the Lower East Side," Julian whispered. "You said you were invisible. I wanted to prove you weren't." Elena traced the glass with her index finger, touching the face of the girl she used to be. "I thought you lost the negatives," she murmured, her voice thick. "I told you," Julian said, his eyes soft and unyielding. "I keep everything that matters." Daniel sat perfectly still. He looked at the closed velvet box on the table, cold, hard, expensive. Then he looked at the cheap frame in his wife's hands. He had given her a fortune in platinum, but Julian had given her back her youth. Elena looked up at Julian, and for a moment, Daniel ceased to exist. The look that passed between them wasn't about gratitude. It was a shared secret, a language of two people who had survived something together. "I love it," she whispered, clutching the frame to her chest. Daniel took a sip of his coffee. It was lukewarm. He realized then that he could buy her the world, but he couldn't buy the way she was looking at Julian. He was the husband who provided the house, but Julian was the artist who knew who lived inside it. The call came at 5:15 a.m., piercing the heavy silence of the master bedroom like a drill. It was the project manager for the Hudson Yards Tower, a sensor alarm on the foundation retaining wall. In the world of structural engineering, it was a code red that demanded immediate physical presence. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the panic on the other end. Behind him, Elena stirred under the duvet. She made a soft, contented sound in her sleep, her hand reaching out for a warmth that wasn't there. For a brief, irrational moment, Daniel considered ignoring the call. He considered letting the wall crack, letting the millions of dollars in liability pile up, just so he wouldn't have to leave his wife alone in this house with him. "I'm on my way," Daniel said into the phone, his voice scraping against the dry morning air. He dressed in the dark, pulling on his suit like armor. Downstairs, the house was still sleeping. The door to the guest suite was closed, but Daniel paused outside of it, listening. Silence. A heavy, innocent silence that felt mocking. By the time he reached Grand Central, the anxiety had settled deep in his gut, a cold weight that had nothing to do with the freezing rain lashing against the train windows. The city was in that strange, suspended animation between Christmas and New Year's. Empty streets, gray slush, and the hollow echo of a metropolis on pause. He spent the morning on the construction site, surrounded by concrete, steel, and shouting men. This was his element. This was where he made sense, calculating loads, predicting stress, reinforcing weak points. But for the first time in his career, the logic of physics failed to calm him. He couldn't calculate the load-bearing capacity of his own marriage. At 1 p.m., he stepped into a quiet coffee shop on 10th Avenue and dialed Elena's number. It rang 4 times. 5. "Hello?" Her voice was breathless, airy, as if she had been running or laughing. "Hey," Daniel said, gripping his paper cup. "I just wanted to check in. The site is a mess, but I should be on the 4:00 p.m. train." "Oh, don't rush," Elena said. "We're fine. We're actually in the attic." Daniel frowned. "The attic? Why?" "Julian wanted to see my old portfolios, the ones from college. I didn't even know we still had them up there. We've been digging through boxes for hours. It's..." God, Daniel, it's like a time capsule. Did you know I used to sketch charcoal portraits? I knew, Daniel said, though he had never seen them. She had never offered to show him. It's dusty as hell up here, but we found a bottle of wine from our wedding year that we never opened. Can you believe that? We're going to let it breathe and have it with dinner. We found our wedding year. We. Elena, Daniel said, his voice tightening. That wine was for our 10th anniversary. There was a pause on the line, a beat of silence where the breathlessness evaporated, replaced by a cool, defensive tone. It's just wine, Daniel. It was going to turn to vinegar if we kept waiting for a special occasion. Julian says wine is meant to be drunk, not worshipped. Julian says, Daniel repeated, the words tasting like ash. I have to go, Elena said, her voice softening, but not for him. It was the distraction of someone looking at something else. He found the canvas, the big one. I need to see this. Drive safe. Daniel. The line went dead. Daniel lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. He could see it clearly. The dust motes dancing in the attic light, the intimacy of shared discovery, the two of them sitting on the floorboards, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that didn't include him. He wasn't just at work. He was in exile. And back in Westport, in the sanctuary of his own home, the ghost of her past was busy rewriting their history, one box at a time. The train pulled into the Westport station at 8:45 p.m., later than Daniel had promised. The freezing rain had turned into a heavy, wet snow, coating the windshield of his Range Rover as he navigated the winding roads back to his neighborhood. He felt a peculiar exhaustion, the kind that settles in the bones not from physical labor, but from the sustained effort of holding back a scream. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark save for the amber glow of the Christmas tree lights in the front window. It looked peaceful, the picture of a suburban dream he had worked 15 years to secure. But as he killed the engine, the silence of the house felt less like tranquility and more like a held breath. He unlocked the front door quietly. He didn't call out. He told himself it was because he didn't want to wake them if they had turned in early. But the truth was darker. He wanted to see them before they saw him. He wanted to catch the reality of the house before they had time to rearrange it for his benefit. The hallway smelled of wood smoke and the rich, tannic scent of old wine. Daniel walked past the dining room. On the sideboard, the bottle of their 10th anniversary Cabernet, the 2012 vintage he had bid on at auction, sat empty. The cork lay beside it, discarded carelessly. 2 glasses sat on the table, stained with purple residue. They hadn't just tasted it, they had devoured it. Daniel moved toward the living room, his footsteps muffled by the thick runners. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The large, L-shaped sectional sofa, usually an expanse of pristine beige linen, was now a nest of pillows and blankets. And there they were. They weren't having sex. In some ways, what Daniel saw was worse. They were asleep, collapsed into the cushions in a tangle of limbs that spoke of a deep, unconscious comfort. Elena was curled up on the left side, her head resting on a pillow that was dangerously close to Julian's shoulder. Her face was relaxed, softened by a peace Daniel hadn't seen in months. Julian was sprawled next to her, one arm thrown back over his head, his mouth slightly open. But it wasn't his proximity that made Daniel's blood turn to ice. It was what he was wearing. Draped over Julian's shoulders, buttoned halfway up against the draft, was Daniel's gray cashmere cardigan, the one Daniel wore on Sunday mornings, the one that smelled like his cedar closet. Julian wasn't just inhabiting the guest room anymore. He was wearing the master's skin. It was a tableau of domestic intimacy that completely excluded the husband. They looked like the couple who had built this life, exhausted after a long day of shared memories. And Daniel was the intruder standing in the hallway in a wet trench coat, holding a briefcase full of blueprints for buildings that didn't matter. He stood there for a long minute, watching the rise and fall of their chests. The boundary hadn't been crossed with a shout or a bang. It had been eroded inch by inch until a man could walk into his own living room and find another man wearing his clothes, drinking his wine, and dreaming beside his wife. Daniel stepped back, the floorboard creaking under his weight. Julian stirred. His eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented. He looked at Daniel standing in the shadows. He didn't jump. He didn't look guilty. He simply blinked, pulled the gray cashmere tighter around his chest, and offered a sleepy, half-formed smile. "You're back," Julian rasped, his voice barely a whisper. We didn't wait up. He didn't move away from Elena. He didn't take off the sweater. He just lay there comfortable in the warmth that Daniel had paid for, claiming the space as if he had always been there. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a cavern of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the deafening roar of New York's elite trying to outdrink the old year. Daniel stood near a pillar, adjusting his bow tie for the 10th time, feeling the silk choke him. He held 2 flutes of champagne, the stems growing warm in his clammy hands. He was waiting for Elena. She was on the dance floor, a vision in shimmering silver that moved like liquid mercury under the lights. But she wasn't dancing with him. She was dancing with Julian. Julian had managed to pull together a vintage tuxedo that fit him with an irritating perfection, slightly loose in the shoulders, suggesting a casual elegance that made Daniel's bespoke suit look like a uniform. They were moving to a fast-paced swing number, a relic of the jazz age that Julian loved. They laughed as they spun, a synchronized blur of motion that required a deep, kinetic knowledge of each other's bodies. "Your wife has incredible energy tonight," a colleague shouted over the music, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "Hasn't seen her this alive in years." "Yes," Daniel said, his voice flat. "She's very happy." He watched them. He watched how Julian whispered something in her ear that made her throw her head back in laughter, a raw, open sound that was lost in the cacophony of the brass band but visible in the arch of her throat. He watched how her hand lingered on Julian's neck, fingers splayed, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in the room. The music shifted. The band slowed down, transitioning into a swelling, sentimental ballad as the MC's voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, 5 minutes to midnight. Grab your loved ones." The crowd surged. Couples pressed closer together, forming intimate islands in the sea of people. Daniel stepped forward, navigating through the crush. He needed to be there. The midnight kiss was the seal, the contract renewal of marriage. If he could just hold her when the balloon drop happened, if he could just anchor her back to reality, maybe they could survive this week. He saw them near the center of the floor. They had stopped dancing but hadn't separated. They were standing close, forehead to forehead, encased in a private silence that defied the noise around them. "Elena," Daniel said. He was close enough to touch her arm, but the noise swallowed his voice. 10, 9. The crowd began the chant, a rhythmic, pounding wave. Daniel reached out. He touched her elbow. "Elena, it's time." She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. It was as if he were a ghost passing through a wall. Her eyes were locked on Julian's face, searching for something in his gaze, forgiveness, permission, or perhaps a reflection of the girl she used to be. 6, 5, 4. Julian raised a hand and cupped her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. It was a gesture of ownership so tender it was violent. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! The room exploded. Confetti cannons fired, filling the air with a blizzard of gold paper. Balloons rained down. The band struck up Auld Lang Syne. Daniel stood frozen, his hand still hovering in the empty air where her elbow had been. Elena didn't kiss Julian. That might have been bearable. A drunken mistake. Instead, she did something worse. As the clock struck, she buried her face in Julian's neck, wrapping her arms around him and holding him with a desperate, crushing strength. She closed her eyes, shutting out the ballroom, the husband, and the future. She looked like a woman who had finally come home. Julian looked up, over Elena's silver-clad shoulder, and met Daniel's gaze. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a sad resignation. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, while Daniel stood 3 feet away, holding 2 glasses of champagne that no one would drink, showered in gold confetti that felt like debris from a disaster. The sun rose on New Year's Day with a cruel, piercing clarity. It was the kind of cold, bright morning that exposed every flaw in the landscape. The dirty slush on the roadside, the bare branches of the oak trees, and the wreckage of the night before. Daniel moved through the master bedroom like a phantom. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. He knew the geography of this room better than the back of his hand. He had designed the addition himself 5 years ago. He opened his closet and pulled out a single leather weekender bag. Elena was asleep in the center of the bed, buried under the duvet. She was breathing deeply, her face pressed into the pillow. Oblivious to the sound of zippers and the soft thud of shoes being placed into a bag. She looked innocent, almost childlike, stripped of the silver gown and the diamonds. But Daniel knew better now. He knew that the innocence was just a trick of the morning light. He packed methodically. Shirts, trousers, toiletries. He didn't pack the watch she had given him on Christmas morning. He left it on the dresser next to the small velvet box containing the platinum necklace she had barely touched. He walked to the side of the bed and looked down at her. He waited for a surge of anger, a desire to shake her awake and scream, to demand an explanation for the humiliation in the ballroom. But there was nothing. Just a hollow, echoing exhaustion. He realized the marriage hadn't ended at midnight. It had ended the moment she invited the past into their future and expected him to pay for the ticket. Daniel walked downstairs. The house was silent. The guest room door was ajar, and he could hear the heavy, snoring rhythm of Julian's sleep. The sound was grating, unrefined, stripping away the mystery of the tortured artist. In the kitchen, Daniel placed his house key and his wedding band on the granite island. The ring made a sharp clack against the stone, the only loud noise he had made all morning. It sat there, a small circle of gold in the vast, empty kitchen. He walked out the front door, got into his Range Rover, and backed out of the driveway. He didn't look back at the house. He turned onto the main road and drove toward the highway, the silence in the car finally feeling like peace. Elena woke up 3 hours later. Her head was pounding, a dull throb behind her eyes from the champagne. She rolled over, reaching automatically for the warmth on the other side of the bed. Her hand hit cool, crisp sheets. "Daniel?" she croaked. Silence. She sat up, blinking against the glare of the snow outside. The house felt wrong. It was too quiet. Usually, by 10 a.m., there was the smell of coffee, the sound of the news playing softly downstairs, the presence of order. She pulled on a robe and walked out into the hallway. Daniel? She pushed open the guest room door. Julian was still asleep, tangled in the sheets, his mouth open, the room smelling of stale wine and body odor. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a middle-aged man with a headache. A sudden, sharp pang of irritation shot through her. She went downstairs to the kitchen. The counters were clean. The coffee machine was cold. "Daniel!" she called again, louder this time, a thread of panic weaving into her voice. She saw it then, the small pile on the island. Elena walked over to it slowly, her bare feet cold on the tile. She picked up the key. Then she picked up the ring. It was heavy in her palm, still holding the ghost of his warmth. There was no note. There was no ultimatum. There was just the ring and the silence. "Where's the coffee?" Julian's voice rasped from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, scratching his chest, looking bleary-eyed and demanding. God, my head is killing me. Did Daniel make breakfast? Elena looked at Julian. She really looked at him. She saw the selfishness in his posture, the dependency in his eyes, the chaotic energy that was charming for a week, but exhausting for a lifetime. She looked around her beautiful, sturdy house, the house that Daniel kept standing, and felt the foundation crack. She had chosen the past, and now, standing in the cold light of the new year, she realized she was the only one left to pay the bill. "No," Elena whispered, her fingers closing tight around the cold gold ring. "Daniel is gone." "He'll be back," Julian yawned, moving toward the fridge. Elena looked at the empty driveway through the window. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he wouldn't. The guest had become the resident, and she was finally, utterly alone.